The string quartet began its slow climb toward the first swell, and a breeze lifted the white ribbons along the aisle, carrying the smell of salt and eucalyptus through the open-air pavilion. The Golden Gate shimmered to my left like a brass hinge on the horizon, and somewhere behind me, a champagne cork popped early, a soft gasp drowned by applause. I took one step toward the light and stopped because the two front-row chairs on my side, reserved with thin calligraphy that read Mother and Father, were perfectly painfully empty. My throat tightened as the sunlight glanced off the polished oak of those chairs, catching the dust motes that spun like slow snow in the air. A gull cried overhead. One of our photographers lowered her camera and looked away, as if averting her eyes might spare me this moment. Daniel turned at the altar, searching for me with a smile I could feel even from 30 yards, and all I could think was how absence can be louder than music. If you've ever stood in a room full of joy and felt a draft of cold pass right through you, you know the weight of an empty seat. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, and if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, tap that like button. So this story finds someone who needs it. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happened after those empty chairs changed everything I thought family meant. But to understand why those chairs were empty, and why their emptiness mattered more than any toast that night, you need to know how my family measured love. I grew up outside Boston in a colonial with blue shutters and a precise lawn that my father regarded like a quarterly report. We hosted dinners where crystal clinked like ice, and conversations skimmed the surface of safe topics, market trends, law firm gossip, who'd been accepted where. In photographs, we look like the kind of family who laughs with white teeth and stands in straight lines. In memory, I hear more corrections than laughter. My father Richard worked at a bank where words like risk and exposure made him straighten his tie. My mother Judith argued corporate cases with the kind of poise that could make an earthquake feel negotiable. They were good at being seen. It was their private weather that chilled the house. Praise didn't arrive on birthdays or in small compliments. It showed up with conditions stapled to it. An A- suggested I'd relax. A smile at breakfast came attached to a reminder that people were watching and that I was in some way a reflection in their glass. Activities appeared on my schedule the way appointments land on a partner's calendar: tennis for optics, piano for discipline, debate for polish. I learned to iron pleats and tuck doubt into quiet corners. Edward, my brother, moved through that world like a well-fitted suit. He was everything my parents could frame and display. Harvard early lab accolades a path toward medicine that mirrored their conviction about what a life should look like. Holiday dinners were often a tour through Edward's brochures, rotations, mentors, a professor who said the word exceptional, and then said it again for emphasis. I loved my brother. I learned also that loving him required I make myself smaller inside the applause. What I loved, the thing that pulled me back to myself, was the glow of a screen in a dark bedroom, and the language tucked inside it. I fell for code, and the way a good design feels like a hand extended to a stranger. My father called it dabbling. My mother called it fine for now. When I won a high school art award, they missed the exhibit to attend a dinner honoring Edward's research project. I stood beside my piece while other parents took photos and pressed their palms to their children's shoulders. And I recorded a quiet vow that I didn't know how to keep yet. College was supposed to be the bridge that soothed all of that, the proof that if I met their metrics, we might meet in the middle. I kept my GPA near perfect and wore the right blazer to interviews. When acceptance letters came, my father congratulated our neighbors on their daughter's Wharton scholarship and nodded at me like we'd met once at a fundraiser. That's when I realized approval in our house wasn't something you earned. It was something you performed, like a part in a very long play. After graduation, I chose San Francisco. It wasn't rebellion so much as breath. I said yes to an entry-level role at a UI firm where the coffee was cheap and the servers hummed in a spare bedroom. My father offered me a safer path back in Boston, wrapped in a family friend's business card and the phrase "for your own good." When I said no, The light in our kitchen looked a little colder, and the word support took on a new meaning. He withdrew it. I learned what rent looks like when it comes out of your own account, and what ramen tastes like when it becomes a routine instead of a joke. In that little apartment, the one with the fire escape that squealed when you stepped on it, and the view of a brick wall painted with fading ivy, I met Daniel. He spoke about security, like a doctor talks about the body. And when I told him I was tired of being an idea on someone else's paper, he said without posture or performance, "Then let's make something that can stand." He didn't fix me. He made space. The first time I saw my parents see him, it was on a screen. Daniel's tie wasn't perfect, and his hair made a small rebellion at his collar. My mother's smile was warm and thin at once. My father's questions landed where pedigree lives: background connections, family friends. When the call ended, my mother phoned me back and peeled the charm from her voice. "You're being impulsive." She said the word impulsive shaped like a verdict. My father added that Daniel and I came from different worlds, a phrase that sounded like he was reading from a manual on how to fold people into categories. Time has a way of quieting certain arguments and sharpening others. 2 years later, we planned a wedding that felt like us: open-air clean, lines the bay as our stained glass. I addressed 2 envelopes by hand, as if script could soften the past, one to my parents, one to Edward, and I wrote what I had never fully said out loud. "I want you there." It would mean everything. The cards came back in a thin stack 2 weeks later, 3 identical squares checked, regretfully declines. Edward added hospital duty like an apology someone else had written. I didn't cry then. I went for a walk on a street that smelled like rain and hot concrete, and I watched a woman pull a child's hood up as the wind picked up a small, reflexive act of care that loosened something I'd kept cinched for years. Back home, Daniel set a mug of tea on the counter and didn't say a single at least. He stood with me in the kind of silence that cleans the clutter from a room. Wedding plans filled the week's menus and music and the color of ribbon. I swore didn't matter until the day I held it against the sunlight and changed my mind. Jennifer came by with a box of stray necessities: safety pins, breath mints, blotting paper, the kind of things a person packs when they've decided they will be your emergency exit if you need one. Her father offered his arm to walk me down the aisle, the gesture so uncomplicated it nearly undid me. On the morning of our vows, the water was the color of brushed steel, and the fog burned off like a promise kept. Daniel's mother brought a blue handkerchief she'd kept in her jewelry box and folded it into my palm without ceremony. "For luck," she said, and then she hugged me as if there had never been a ledger in her heart. I want to tell you, I didn't think about the empty chairs until I saw them, but that would be a lie I don't owe you. I thought about them in little flashes in the mirror when the stylist tucked a loose curl behind my ear, in the pause before the quartet's first note, in the way the planner checked the front row and then quickly checked it again. Absence doesn't announce itself. It sits down and takes up space. A memory rose up that surprised me with its climb. I was 8, standing at the bottom of our staircase in patent shoes, waiting for my mother to button the back of my dress before a recital. She called down that she needed another minute, that guests had arrived early, that this looks better if we're not late. I learned in increments where I ranked on the list of things that needed tending. I learned to carry a needle so I could fasten myself. The officiant cleared his throat softly, and the quartet lifted the bow to its first string. Guests stood like a tide and turned. Daniel waited at the end of the aisle in a suit we'd picked out together. The cuffs a hair too long because his hands move when he talks, and fabric deserves a little forgiveness. He looked at me like a person who remembers every version of you and loves all of them at once. It was almost enough to push those chairs out of the frame. Almost. I felt the weight of what wasn't there press against the lace at my collarbone. My mother's voice, instructing a lifetime of posture, whispered where to place my shoulders. My father's approval hovered at the edges like a rumor. My brother's soft busy settled onto the aisle runner like a leaf that didn't belong to any tree in this garden. My chest ached. in that steady, dull way that lets you move, but makes each breath a small negotiation. Jennifer touched my elbow. "Ready?" she asked, and I heard the word in a dozen registers, ready to walk, ready to accept, ready to let go. Behind us, someone shut a door gently. Ahead somewhere a fork rested on a plate with the slow chime of porcelain. I looked again at those two chairs, the oak gleaming the programs laid carefully across their seats, like little flags of surrender. And for a second, that felt longer than it was. I imagined getting up in the night to move them into the sun, as if warmth could coax ghosts to sit. Then I let the picture go, the way you let go of a rope when your palms are already raw. I took Daniel's hand once in my mind, before I took it in fact. The quartet rose. The sea drew its breath. I stepped forward, and with that step, I crossed a border I couldn't uncross into a life where love would not be purchased or negotiated, where chairs were filled by people who chose to be there. Somewhere in those first few steps, past the lavender planted along the walkway, past a child who waved with both hands, past the photographer who had found her breath again, I felt a split almost imperceptible, like the quiet strain in a seam long before it tears. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was the smallest beginning of something I didn't yet have words for, the kind of change that arrives without noise and refuses to leave. The music swelled. A gull traced a white line over the bay. I lifted my bouquet and the ribbons whispered against my wrist, as if reminding me to keep moving. Behind me, the door that had closed did not open. Ahead of me, Daniel's eyes filled, and the light caught at the corner like a promise. And there, with the water bright and the empty chairs steady as stones, I realized I had just stepped into a story where silence would be my first teacher. Daniel's hand was warm against mine as the music faded. The applause around us blurred into a low hum, like the tide against the rocks below the bay. When I looked into his face, I saw the kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission to exist. I tried to hold on to that calm, to let it fill the space my family had left behind. But when the lights dimmed and the evening air cooled, the empty chairs at the front of the aisle became shadows I couldn't ignore. Later, as we walked down the pier toward the water, the city lights flickering like scattered candles, Daniel brushed his thumb against my wedding ring and said quietly, "We did it, Nat. We really did." His voice was soft, steady, the way it always was when he knew I was on the edge of breaking. I nodded, but words wouldn't come. I could still see those two chairs, perfect, polished, untouched, and the hollow ache that came with them. The reception glowed with laughter and clinking glasses. My friends danced barefoot under string lights, and Daniel's parents moved together as if they'd been practicing for this night their whole lives. His mother found me near the dessert table, pressing a slice of cake into my hand. "Eat something, sweetheart," she said, her eyes full of kindness that felt almost unfamiliar. I smiled, thanked her, and promised I would. But later, I left it untouched, the frosting melting in the salt air. When Jennifer's father raised his glass for a toast, the sound of his voice carried over the soft hum of the crowd. "To love that chooses you," he said, "and to family that shows up." Everyone cheered, and for a moment, I could almost believe the empty spaces in my heart had been filled. Yet that night, when Daniel and I returned to our small apartment, I stood by the window in my wedding dress, looking out over the quiet street, and whispered to no one. They really didn't come. The silence that followed was heavy, but Daniel didn't try to fill it. He just wrapped his arms around me and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Then they missed it," he murmured. "They missed the best day of our lives." We spent our honeymoon in a cabin near Big Sur. No resorts, no staff, just the sound of the Pacific pressing against the cliffs. We cooked simple meals, fell asleep to rain on the roof, and talked about the future we wanted to build. I sent my parents one photograph, Daniel's hand in mine, the ocean stretching beyond us, and wrote, "We're happy." The message stayed unread for weeks. When the read receipt finally appeared, nothing came after. Not a single word. Back in San Francisco, real life began again. Our apartment was small, but full of light. Daniel worked long hours at the cybersecurity firm, and I spent my days designing interfaces for a startup that felt more dream than job. My parents didn't call. Holidays passed in quiet dinners with friends who had become our family by choice. I learned that loneliness doesn't always feel like emptiness. Sometimes it feels like peace. Then one evening, 6 months into my job, Daniel came home late with an energy I hadn't seen in him before. His hair was still damp from the rain, his coat half unbuttoned, and he paced the living room like he was holding a secret too large for his chest. "Nat," he said, "I've been thinking." That night, over leftover soup and the hum of our old radiator, he told me his idea software that could detect vulnerabilities before hackers ever breached a system. He explained it with the kind of passion that made every technical word sound like poetry. Companies are always reacting after the damage, he said, sketching diagrams on a napkin. But what if we could stop the breach before it starts? I listened, tracing his messy handwriting with my finger, and for the first time in months, I saw the same spark in him that I'd felt when I first started designing. "Then let's do it," I said. He blinked, surprised. "I mean it. Let's build it." Within weeks, our apartment transformed into an office. The dining table disappeared under cables and notebooks. We lived on coffee noodles and the promise of something better. Every night, I fell asleep to the low hum of the server in our spare room. Daniel would stay up until dawn, testing, rewriting, perfecting. Money was tight. We stretched every paycheck, skipped vacations, and took on side projects just to keep the lights on. I sold my old camera and a few pieces of jewelry I'd kept from childhood. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the quiet moments when I wondered if my parents were right, if all this effort would end in nothing. But every time doubt crept in, Daniel reminded me of what we were building. "It's not about proving anyone wrong," he said. "It's about building something that matters." A year later, we had a prototype, a program that could predict breaches weeks in advance. When we presented it to our first potential client, the conference room was too large, the air too cold, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Daniel stood beside me, explaining every line of code like it was a heartbeat. When the company's CEO leaned back stunned and said, "We want this," I had to bite my lip to stop the tears. That first contract saved us. It led to another, then another. Venture firms started calling. By the third year, we had an office, a small team, and a name, Secure Tech. Through it all, I kept checking my parents' names online, wondering if they'd heard about us. When Forbes published a small feature, "Boston Native Revolutionizes Cybersecurity," I sent the link to my father. No reply. I told myself I didn't care, but some part of me still checked my inbox every night before bed. Daniel noticed once, catching me scrolling through my mother's social media. "Still no word?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "They post about Edward every week," I said. "His research, his house, his vacations. I guess that's enough family for them." He reached over, closing the laptop softly. "Then stop knocking on a door that's never opened for you." His tone wasn't angry, just tired. And he was right. I had built a life they'd never see, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. 5 years passed that way. Secure Tech grew faster than we could keep up. We hired new teams, moved into a sleek building overlooking the bay, and traveled for conferences that once felt like dreams. At our 5th anniversary dinner, Daniel raised his glass and said, "To the life we built when no one believed we could." I smiled, but inside, A familiar ache stirred the one that whispers. Would they be proud now? The next morning, I found my answer in a way I never expected. Daniel stood in our living room, grinning like a schoolboy holding a small box with a red ribbon. No blindfolds this time, he said. Outside, parked at the curb, was a car so beautiful it almost didn't look real. Sapphire blue, polished to glass with a silver emblem that caught the light like a star. A Rolls-Royce Dawn, he said, slipping the keys into my palm. Happy anniversary, Mrs. Harrison. I laughed, shaking my head. Daniel, this is too much. Maybe, he said, but you deserve to see what we built reflected back at us. Every mile, every late night, every risk. We took a photo in front of it, the wind catching my hair, the city skyline behind us. I posted it later that day with a simple caption about hard work, partnership, and gratitude. It was meant for friends, maybe a few colleagues. By morning, it had gone viral. Messages poured in from people I hadn't heard from in years. Classmates, old co-workers, even a few investors I barely knew. Then 3 days later, my phone rang. The name on the screen froze me where I stood. My mother. Her voice was bright, almost musical. Natalie, darling, I saw your post. That car is stunning. We've been so proud watching you from afar. She paused as if expecting me to fill the silence. Your father and I think it's time we all got together again. A proper family meeting. Tomorrow at noon? Her tone made it sound like we'd spoken last week, not 5 years ago. I agreed slowly, my pulse echoing in my ears. When I hung up, Daniel was standing in the doorway watching my face. They saw the car, I said quietly. Now they remember I exist. He didn't need to ask what I was feeling. He just took my hand, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the city drifted through the open window, the same city that had built me back from silence. That night, I lay awake, listening to the faint sound of traffic below. For years, I had wanted to hear their voices again. But now that I had all I could feel was a strange mix of anger, sorrow, and something close to resolve. When the first light of morning touched the walls, I sat up and looked at Daniel sleeping beside me. The sapphire car gleamed outside, waiting. I knew then that I would go to Boston not to seek forgiveness, but to finish a story that had begun with 2 empty chairs by the water. The next morning, the city was still half asleep when I slipped out of bed. The fog outside pressed against the window, soft and gray, curling around the edges of the glass like breath. I watched the quiet street below, headlights sliding past in thin streaks of gold, and felt that old familiar ache in my chest, the one that came whenever my parents reappeared after years of silence, as if nothing had happened. Daniel stirred, his voice still heavy with sleep. You're thinking about it again. I nodded without turning. They said noon, I whispered. A family meeting. The words felt brittle on my tongue. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and reached for my hand. Then we'll go, he said simply. But this time, you won't go to prove anything. You'll go to see the truth for what it is. By the time we boarded the flight to Boston, I'd built a plan in my head, every word, every pause. If they wanted to talk about status and success, I'd give them what they valued most. And when the moment came, I'd make sure they saw exactly who they had chosen to overlook. The flight was quiet, the kind that hums you into thought. Daniel read beside me, his hand resting on my knee while I stared out at the pale sky folding over the horizon. Boston looked smaller when we landed, the skyline half hidden behind a sheet of winter haze. We picked up the car Daniel had shipped ahead of us, the same sapphire blue Rolls-Royce that had apparently made me visible again. Driving through the streets I'd once called home felt like walking through an old photograph. Every corner held a memory. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep the bakery where my mother used to order cakes shaped like books, the park bench where my father made business calls while pretending to watch me play. When we turned onto Beacon Hill, my chest tightened. The houses looked untouched by time, brick facades, iron railings, windows trimmed in white paint. My parents' home stood near the top of the hill, exactly as I remembered, symmetrical, immaculate, and silent. I parked in the circular drive, the engine purring softly, the blue of the car reflecting against the front door like an accusation. Before I could knock, the door swung open. My mother stood there in a cream suit, every strand of hair perfectly placed. Her smile was practiced, warm enough for neighbors, cold enough for me to notice. "Natalie," she said, extending her arms just enough to suggest an embrace. "You look wonderful." Daniel stepped forward, greeting her politely. She hugged him with surprising warmth, as if rewriting history required no apology. My father appeared behind her, his expression fixed between curiosity and appraisal. "That's quite a car you brought," he said, his eyes lingering on the driveway. "You must be doing well." So that was the first thing he chose to say. Not "I've missed you." Not "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Just admiration for the car that had bought their attention. Inside, the house smelled faintly of polish and citrus. The walls were lined with family portraits, Edward's graduation, Edward's wedding, Edward holding a newborn niece I'd never met. My photos stopped somewhere around college, as if the years after had been erased. Edward and his wife, Catherine, were already seated in the living room, drinks in hand. He stood when I entered, his smile tight. "Little sister," he said, as though the nickname could rewind time. "Long 5 years, huh?" "Yes," I said. 5 years since you couldn't make it to my wedding because of hospital duty." The words slipped out before I could stop them. The air tightened for a moment, until my mother clapped her hands lightly. "Let's not dwell on the past. We're all together now, and that's what matters." Dinner was served with silver dishes and careful conversation. My mother's voice floated over the table like music she'd practiced. "So," she began, "we've been hearing about your company. SecureTech, right?" "It's been in the papers." My father leaned in. "The cybersecurity field is booming. Tell me, what's your current valuation?" "How many employees?" I smiled, keeping my tone polite. "We've grown quite a bit. Around 100 employees now." Edward swirled the ice in his glass. "Impressive," he said. "You know, hospitals could really use that kind of software. Maybe we could explore a collaboration." Every sentence that followed sounded rehearsed. They wanted numbers, percentages, contacts, anything that hinted at how they might benefit. Not once did they ask how I'd been or whether I was happy. I realized then that I wasn't sitting at a family table. I was sitting in a boardroom disguised as one. Daniel stayed quiet, his hand brushing mine under the table. He didn't have to say a word. He knew this was the moment I'd been preparing for. When the plates were cleared, my father refilled his glass and smiled as if sharing a secret. "If you're considering taking your company public, I could make introductions. Some of the best investment bankers in Boston are old friends. It's complicated for newcomers, but I could guide you through it." So that was it. The reunion wasn't about forgiveness. It was about opportunity. I let the silence settle, then nodded. "I appreciate that, Dad. Actually, Daniel and I do have some news to share." My mother straightened her eyes bright. "News? Oh, Natalie, are you pregnant?" I laughed softly. "No, it's about SecureTech." Daniel placed his napkin beside his plate, his tone calm and steady. "We've accepted an acquisition offer." My father's fork paused midair. "From whom? Tech Global," I said. "The deal closes next month." And for how much? 500 million, Daniel answered. The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the chandelier above us. My father blinked once, twice. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. Edward coughed, nearly spilling his drink. Catherine whispered, "500 million, as if saying it out loud might make it real." Then came the rush. Questions, congratulations, half-formed plans. My father leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "This changes everything," he said. "We must celebrate properly. And you'll need guidance, of course, how to manage your portfolio, where to invest. It's a lot for two people to handle alone." My mother chimed in with talk of estates and charities, names of neighborhoods where we simply must consider buying property. Edward spoke about potential partnerships. Each voice layered over the other until the room felt crowded with their expectations. I looked at Daniel. He gave a small nod, the signal we'd agreed upon before the trip. Rising slowly, I lifted my glass. "Before we talk about the future," I said, "there's something I'd like to share." They all turned toward me, the air suddenly still. 5 years ago, I married the love of my life, I began. None of you were there. You didn't call. You didn't even send a note. When we started our company, you never asked how we were doing, not once. But last week, after seeing a photo of a car online, you remembered me. My mother shifted her smile, faltering. "Natalie, dear, that's not fair. We thought you wanted space." "No," I said quietly. "You gave me silence because I didn't fit the image you wanted to present to your friends. You replaced me with the idea of who you thought I should be." My father's voice hardened. "That's enough. We're here now. We can move forward." I looked at him, calm and steady. "You only showed up when there was something to gain. You see people as transactions, not as family." My mother's eyes darted toward Daniel, as if hoping for help. "Surely you don't mean that, darling. We're proud of you. Proud of what I asked. The money, the car, or the fact that I finally looked successful enough to be worth your attention." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then I took a breath and delivered what I had come to say. "You asked about the acquisition. The offer is real, but we're keeping only 10%. The rest, about 450 million, is going into a foundation we're creating." My mother blinked, confused. "A foundation? The Fresh Start Foundation?" I said, "It'll provide scholarships and small business funding for young people who didn't grow up with privilege. We'll also fund counseling programs for those raised in toxic families, people who were told their worth depended on what they could provide." My father's face turned red. "You're giving away $450 million. Are you out of your mind?" Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "We're not giving it away. We're investing it in something that actually matters." My mother tried a gentler tone. "Philanthropy is lovely, dear, but surely you'll keep more for yourselves. You could buy homes, travel, build generational wealth." "We've already built what we need," I said. "A life we're proud of. The rest belongs to something bigger." Edward leaned back, bitterness creeping into his voice. "So, this was the real reason you came to show us what we lost?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said. "I came to see if anything was left to save." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes glistened without tears, and Edward stared down at his untouched plate. I placed my napkin on the table and stood. "Thank you for dinner, but Daniel and I should be going." My mother reached out, her voice trembling for the first time. "Natalie, please don't leave like this." I paused at the doorway. "I'm not leaving angry," I said softly. "I'm leaving free." As we stepped outside, the evening air hit my skin like fresh water. The Rolls-Royce gleamed under the streetlight, quiet and waiting. Daniel opened the passenger door for me, his hand steady as ever. The house behind us stayed lit, but no one came to the window. We drove down the hill in silence, the city lights stretching out below us like a river of glass. Halfway across the bridge, Daniel reached over and took my hand. "You okay?" I looked out at the water where the reflection of the skyline wavered and broke with every small wave. "Yes," I said finally. "For the first time, I think I am." The road ahead curved toward the airport, the lights of the city fading behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Somewhere between that house and the open highway, the weight I'd carried for years finally began to lift. Back in San Francisco, the sky was low and gray when we landed. The ocean fog drifted through the streets like a slow breath, wrapping the city in stillness. Daniel and I didn't speak much on the drive home. We didn't need to. There are silences that ache, and others that heal. This one felt like both. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Daniel typing in the kitchen. He was drafting the first documents for the foundation. A stack of legal forms sat beside him, half-filled, marked with his steady handwriting. When he looked up, his eyes softened. "We really did it," he said. I leaned against the doorway, the weight of the last few days settling into something gentler. "We did," I answered. "And we're going to build something better out of it." That week our days filled with calls and paperwork. Lawyers, accountants, nonprofit consultants, all of them surprised by how much we intended to give away. Some tried to persuade us to reconsider. "You could fund the foundation with just 10% and still make a difference," one advisor argued. "You don't need to sacrifice this much." I looked at Daniel across the conference table. His calm expression didn't waver. "We're not sacrificing anything," he said. "We're investing in people," and just like that, the Fresh Start Foundation was born. We launched quietly, no press conferences, no interviews. The first scholarships went to students who reminded me of myself at that age, ambitious, uncertain, waiting for someone to believe in them. I still remember meeting the first recipient in person, a young woman named Alana from the Bronx. She was 19, studying computer science at a community college while working nights at a grocery store. When she saw me, her voice trembled. "You're the reason I can stay in school," she said, gripping the edge of her acceptance letter. "I almost dropped out this semester." I smiled, though my throat tightened. "No," I told her. "You're the reason we built this." Moments like that changed something in me. The cold ambition I'd once used to earn my parents' approval was replaced with something quieter, steadier purpose. I still worked long hours, but the work felt different now. Daniel often stayed late with me at the office, sketching plans for coding programs, small business incubators, and mentorship networks. We ate takeout from the same table where SecureTech had first begun, but the air between us carried peace instead of anxiety. 6 months passed before my parents reached out again. The first email came from my mother. The subject line read, "Let's talk." The message itself was short, almost clinical. "Your father and I have been following the news about your foundation. We're concerned you might be giving too much away. Let's discuss this before it's too late." There was no greeting, no warmth, just the same tone she used when she was drafting contracts. I didn't reply. 2 days later, a letter arrived from my father. His handwriting was precise as ever. "I hope you'll reconsider these impulsive financial decisions. You've worked hard to achieve what you have. Don't squander your legacy." Legacy. That word had always meant status to them. To me, it finally meant something else. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in a drawer, and never answered. A few weeks later, my brother called. His voice was careful, measured, like he'd rehearsed what to say. "Nat, I'm worried about you," he began. You should talk to someone, a financial advisor, or maybe even a therapist. Giving away that much money, it's not normal. Maybe not in our family, I said quietly. But maybe that's exactly why I'm doing it. He hesitated. Mom's been upset. She thinks you're trying to punish them. I looked out the window at the fog lifting over the bay. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm freeing myself. After that, there were no more calls. Silence again, but this time I didn't dread it. It felt like the calm after a storm that had lasted too many years. Around that time, Daniel started noticing how I lingered in the nursery aisle at stores, running my fingers over soft blankets or tiny shoes. One evening, he set down his laptop and smiled across the room. You keep looking at those little onesies like they're secrets you're not ready to tell me, he teased. I laughed, caught off guard, but before I could answer, he added softly, would it be so bad if there was another reason to build all this? That question stayed with me for weeks. When the test turned positive, I stood in the bathroom staring at the small blue line until the edges blurred. Daniel found me there, holding the stick like it was proof of something sacred. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around me and pressed his forehead to mine. We spent the following months preparing for a kind of joy I hadn't known before. Our house filled with soft light and the quiet sound of anticipation. Daniel painted the nursery pale yellow, humming under his breath, while I read him name lists from the doorway. We settled on Lily. It felt simple, pure like a beginning. My mother sent one more message before Lily was born. She left a voicemail, her tone practiced but trembling around the edges. Natalie, I heard you're expecting. Congratulations. Maybe this child will help you understand how much parents sacrifice. Please, call us. I listened to it once, then deleted it, not out of anger, but clarity. Love built on conditions isn't love, it's leverage. And I refused to let my daughter inherit that. When Lily arrived on a spring morning, the world seemed softer. The hospital window overlooked the bay, the same one where Daniel had proposed years ago. He held her first, his voice shaking as he whispered her name. I watched his hands steady, careful, full of awe, and thought how different her childhood would be from mine. In the weeks that followed, our home filled with the smell of milk and lavender, the rhythm of late-night feedings and laughter that came easily. I often sat in the nursery's rocking chair with Lily asleep against my chest, the hum of the city faint in the distance. Some nights, I told her stories about the people her parents had helped, the students, the entrepreneurs, the kids, who finally believed they could do something extraordinary. One afternoon, while she napped, I opened an email from Alana, the first scholarship recipient. She had graduated early and landed a position at a tech firm. I just wanted you to know, she wrote, I'm mentoring 2 high school girls now. I'm teaching them everything I wish someone had told me. I smiled through tears. It felt like the foundation was taking root in ways no spreadsheet could ever show. Occasionally, I still thought about my parents, their grand house, the long dinners that never ended with laughter, the way silence used to sit at our table like a guest who refused to leave. But those thoughts didn't hurt the way they once did. They felt distant, like an old echo fading into quiet. Every so often, an envelope arrived from Boston holiday cards, signed only with their names, no messages inside. I placed them in a box labeled Unsent Apologies. One day, I might show them to Lily, not as a lesson in bitterness, but as proof that we all have the power to stop a cycle. One evening, Daniel and I stood by the window, watching the sunset spill gold across the water. Lily was asleep, her small breaths echoing through the baby monitor. He slipped his arm around my waist. Do you ever wish they'd change? he asked quietly. I used to, I said. Now I just hope they find peace in their own way. He nodded, resting his chin on my shoulder. And you? I looked out at the city that had witnessed every version of my life. The ambitious daughter, the unseen bride, the woman who finally stopped asking for permission. I think I already have. Outside, the lights along the bridge flickered on one by one, like a slow exhale. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the waves against the shore and Lily's soft breathing through the monitor. I realized in that stillness that forgiveness didn't always need an audience. Sometimes it was just the decision to keep building love where it had once been denied. Tomorrow, I'd return to the foundation office to meet with a new group of scholarship candidates. Daniel would finalize the next partnership agreement. The world would keep turning, as it always does. But tonight, I held the peace I had spent a lifetime earning, steady, simple, and finally mine. The mornings in our house begin gently now. The sound of the kettle on the stove, the faint rustle of Lily turning in her crib, the distant foghorn from the bay. There's a peace in the routine, something so ordinary, it feels sacred. Sometimes, while Daniel measures coffee grounds, I stand by the window and watch the sunlight move across the water, gold bleeding into blue. For years, I used to chase the kind of calm that only exists when you stop needing to prove anything. Now it arrives quietly, like the tide finding the shore. Lily has started to laugh in her sleep. The sound comes soft at first, a breath, then a giggle that makes her whole face bloom. Daniel says she dreams in colors. I think she dreams in warmth, the kind she was born into, not the kind that must be earned. When I hold her against my chest, her small hands curl into the fabric of my shirt, as if she already knows this world is safe. Most evenings, when she's asleep, I walk down to the small garden behind our house. The air there smells like jasmine and wet soil. I planted those flowers last year, the same week we signed the final paperwork for the foundation. Each time I see them bloom, I think of what it means to start over. Growth doesn't ask for applause, it just reaches for light again and again. The fresh start. Foundation has become something larger than I ever imagined. We opened our second office last fall, and the programs have spread across 5 states. I don't travel as much anymore, but I still read every letter from students who've received grants. Some are short, a single paragraph. Others spill over pages. They write about coding classes in small towns, about opening family-run businesses, about finally feeling seen. Each letter feels like a quiet echo of what I once needed a voice saying, "You're enough as you are." Daniel handles most of the logistics now, though he still laughs that I can't stop checking the numbers myself. He's patient with my habits, the color-coded binders, the late-night spreadsheets, the candle I always light before reviewing applications. You don't have to do it all, he reminds me, and I tell him I know. But it isn't about control anymore. It's about gratitude. Every file I open feels like a life unfolding. A few months ago, Alana came to visit. She's 20 now, confident with that spark in her eyes I remember from our first meeting. She wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and carried a laptop covered in stickers. When she told me she'd been promoted at her firm, she smiled shyly and said, "I thought you should be the first to know." We walked along the waterfront afterward, Lily in her stroller, Daniel trailing a few steps behind, with coffee cups. Alana told me about her new project, teaching coding to high school girls in her neighborhood. "I guess I'm paying it forward," she said, laughing. But then her voice softened. "You gave me more than money, Natalie. You gave me a map." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Some gratitude doesn't need an answer. It lingers like music long after the song ends. Not long after that, another envelope arrived from Boston. The handwriting was familiar, my father's though smaller, less certain. Inside was a simple card with no greeting, only a photograph of their backyard garden in bloom. The message on the back was brief. We heard about the new center in Denver. You've built something remarkable. Take care of yourself. There was no apology, no confession, just acknowledgement. But for the first time, I didn't feel the old sting. I placed the photo on my desk beside a small framed picture of Lily and Daniel and left it there, a quiet reminder that even small gestures can mark the edge of change. A few weeks later, Edward reached out. He was in San Francisco for a medical conference and asked if we could meet for lunch. I agreed, though I kept my expectations low. We met at a quiet cafe near the marina. He arrived in a gray suit, still carrying the calm arrogance that used to fill our childhood home. But when he spoke, there was a hesitance I hadn't heard before. "You look good, Nat," he said, stirring his tea. "Mother showed me pictures of Lily. She's beautiful." "Thank you," I said. He glanced out the window, avoiding my eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about that night, the dinner. You were right. We weren't fair to you." The words hung between us, imperfect, unsteady, but real. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Finally, I said, "I don't need an apology, Edward. I just need you to understand why I stopped trying." He nodded slowly, folding his napkin in half. "I do," he said. "I think I finally do. We didn't talk about our parents or the years we'd lost. Instead, we talked about medicine, about Daniel, about Lily." When we parted, he hugged me a little awkward, but genuine. As I watched him walk away, I realized that forgiveness doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up in the smallest change of tone. Back home that evening, the air smelled of rain. Daniel was in the kitchen rocking Lily to sleep while humming an old tune his mother used to sing. I stood in the doorway watching them. The scene was so ordinary it almost hurt. That's the thing about peace, it doesn't announce itself. It settles quietly in the spaces where chaos used to live. After I tucked Lily into her crib, I stepped out to the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shining like glass. Across the street, the neighbor's porch light flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. I wrapped my sweater tighter and sat down, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I thought about the long path that had led here. The rejection, the years of silence, the dinner table, confrontation that once felt like an ending but had become a beginning. I had spent so much of my life reaching for love that couldn't stretch far enough to meet me. And yet here I was, surrounded by the kind of love that needed no translation. Inside, Daniel's laughter drifted through the screen door as he whispered something to Lily. Her soft giggle followed, and for a moment, the sound seemed to erase every empty chair I had ever sat beside. When the wind picked up, the jasmine swayed against the fence. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent, cool and sweet. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the final thread of resentment loosen. Not vanish, just let go. I don't know if my parents will ever change. Maybe they'll grow old in that house filled with pictures of the son they raised perfectly and the daughter they never understood. Maybe they'll regret it someday. Maybe they won't. But I've stopped waiting for that moment. My peace doesn't depend on their awakening. It lives here in the home I built, in the laughter that fills its walls, in the purpose that wakes me each morning. Sometimes, after Lily's asleep, I whisper to her about the world she's inheriting. I tell her that people are flawed, but love doesn't have to be. That wealth isn't measured in what we keep, but in what we give freely without expecting return. She's too young to understand now, but one day she will. And when she asks about her grandparents, I'll tell her the truth. Not the polished version, but the real one. I'll tell her that I learned strength the hard way, and that sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. The night deepened quiet and steady. The fog returned, softening the city lights until they looked like lanterns floating in water. I could feel Daniel's presence behind me before he spoke. "Come inside," he said gently. "It's getting cold." I turned toward him, smiling. "Just another minute." He nodded and stepped closer, resting his hands on my shoulders. Together, we watched the sky shift from gray to silver, the stars faint behind the mist. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I asked. "All the time," he said. "But I think the best part is how quiet it feels now." I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his breath against my hair. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd earned. As the night settled around us, I finally understood something I'd been chasing for years. Peace isn't a reward for doing the right thing. It's the gift that arrives when you stop needing permission to be happy. If this story found you at the right time, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever learned that peace comes from letting go, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about strength, forgiveness, and the quiet kind of victory that lasts. Because sometimes the real ending isn't walking away, it's finding home within yourself.